The last thing Seo Kael remembered before his life changed forever was the cold blue glow of his phone screen and the sound of rain hitting his dorm window at 2 in the morning. He had been reading again. That was the problem, and also the only thing he was truly good at doing in the middle of the night when his brain refused to let him sleep. The novel had been recommended to him by a classmate who described it in 3 words: sad, beautiful, unfair. That description was accurate enough to make any university student with too much feeling and too little sleep pick it up and read until their eyes burned. The story was set in an Omegaverse world, a fictional universe where people were divided not just by personality or strength but by something called a secondary gender. Alphas were powerful and commanding. Betas were ordinary and steady. Omegas were rare, often gentle, and in this particular world, treated as though their softness was a flaw rather than a feature. The male lead was an alpha named Ryan Nacht. Cold, silver-haired, brilliant, and carrying a wound so deep he had stopped letting anyone near enough to see it. The story followed his slow and painful journey toward love, toward trust, toward something that looked like healing. It was the kind of story that made readers hold their breath for chapters at a time. But Seo Kael had not been thinking about Ryan when he fell asleep. He had been thinking about a different character. A boy named Kael, who appeared briefly in the early pages as the childhood companion of the story's main villain, Victor Lane. The character Kael was soft-spoken, loyal, and completely devoted to Victor despite receiving very little warmth in return. He trusted Victor the way you trust someone who has simply always been there, without ever asking whether they deserve it. In Chapter 3, Victor quietly arranged for a poison tonic to be delivered to Kael's room, and Kael drank it without suspicion, and by Chapter 4 the story had already moved on to other things. No funeral. No mourning. Just a single line noting that the companion was gone, and then the plot continued without him. Seo Kael had found that unbearable. He had set his phone down on his chest and stared at the ceiling for a long time. He thought about the character Kael the way you think about someone real, about how it felt wrong that a person who had done nothing but love the wrong person should be disposed of so quietly. He thought about it until his eyes closed. And then he woke up on a cold stone floor. The first thing he felt was confusion, because the floor of his dorm room was wood, not stone, and he had definitely fallen asleep in his bed. The second thing he felt was cold, spreading through his back and his palms and the side of his face that was pressed against the ground. The third thing he felt was wrong, deep and immediate and physical, because the body he was feeling all of this with was not the right size. His hands, when he pushed himself up, were too slender. His shoulders, when he straightened, were narrower than they should have been. The air that came into his lungs felt different, lighter, like the body carrying it was built with less weight than the one he was used to. He sat up slowly and looked at the room around him. It was small and dim, lit by a single oil lamp on a low wooden table near the door. The walls were dark stone. The ceiling was low and curved slightly, the way old architecture curved when it was built for function rather than comfort. There was a narrow bed against one wall with a rough wool blanket folded at the foot of it. There was a wooden chest in the corner. There was a tiny window set high in the wall, and through it came the gray light of very early morning, the kind of light that existed in the pause between night ending and day beginning. Seo Kael did not scream. He sat very still on the cold floor and pressed his hands flat against the stone and breathed in and breathed out until his heart slowed down to something manageable. Then the memories came. They did not arrive gently. They pressed in from every direction at once, filling the spaces behind his eyes with images and sounds and feelings that were not his own but that his body recognized completely. A boy running through tall grass. A laugh that belonged to someone with golden hair and a wide smile. The smell of old books and soap. The specific ache of being the person who gives more than they receive, who stays when they should probably go, who tells themselves that loyalty is its own kind of love even when no love is returned. The original Kael's memories. He understood then, sitting on that cold floor in a body that did not belong to the person he had been 12 hours ago, that he was inside the novel. He was Kael. The Kael who died in Chapter 3. And from the quality of the grey light coming through the high window, from the particular stillness of the building around him, from the cold morning air that carried the faint sounds of distant bells ringing somewhere across stone courtyard walls, he calculated with a sinking and very specific dread that today was the day before the poison arrived. He had one day. He stood up carefully, testing the body he was now living in. It moved the way the memories told him it would, quietly and with a certain practiced smallness, the kind of way a person moved when they had spent years in spaces where they were tolerated but not entirely welcome. He was at the Alpha Academy, an institution built into the side of a mountain that looked from the outside like something between a fortress and a cathedral. The academy trained the most powerful young alphas in the Omegaverse world, preparing them for the positions of leadership and authority that were essentially designed for them by the nature of this society. Omegas like Kael were not students here. They were permitted on the grounds only if attached to an alpha in some official capacity, and Kael's official capacity was as Victor Lane's personal companion, a position that provided him with a room, meals, and the most fragile possible form of safety. He crossed to the wooden chest and opened it. Inside were the original Kael's few possessions, 2 plain sets of clothing, a small writing kit, a thin book of pressed flowers, and a folded piece of paper at the very bottom that turned out to be a letter from Victor written 2 years ago, calling Kael his most trusted person, his constant, the one he could always rely on. The original Kael had kept that letter so carefully that the folds had worn soft from being opened and closed too many times. Seo Kael read the letter once. Then he folded it back along its worn creases and returned it to the chest and closed the lid. He had the memories of every conversation the original Kael had ever had with Victor Lane. He had the memories of every small kindness and every gentle dismissal, every moment Victor had been warm and every moment he had been subtly cold, and the way the original Kael had always found an explanation for the cold that protected Victor from being the cause of it. Looking at those memories now from the outside, the way you could only see something clearly when you were not inside it, the pattern was unmistakable. Victor had never been cruel loudly. He had been cruel in the way water wears stone, slowly and consistently and with the appearance of simply existing rather than causing harm. He ate breakfast alone. A servant brought a tray without knocking and set it inside the door without speaking, which the original Kael's memories confirmed was completely normal. He ate methodically, thinking while he chewed, because he needed a plan and he needed one that worked within the rules of a world he had only ever read about and not lived inside. The first problem was the poison. It would arrive tonight in the form of a small green glass bottle carried by one of Victor's preferred servants, presented as a health tonic, and the original Kael would drink it without question because Victor had given him health tonics before and the gesture had always felt like being cared for. Seo Kael had no intention of drinking it, but he also had no intention of making his survival obvious. If Victor realized the poison had failed, he would simply try something else, something that Seo Kael might not be able to predict because it would no longer follow the novel's original plot. The second problem was that he had no power and no allies. In the original story, Kael had been entirely dependent on Victor for his position at the academy. Without Victor's sponsorship, an Omega of no rank and no family had essentially no standing here. He needed to begin building something of his own, quietly and carefully, before Victor noticed he was doing it. The third problem walked directly into him at the end of the East Corridor at 7:30 in the morning. He had been using the original Kael's mental map of the academy to find the library, moving through the stone hallways with his head slightly lowered in the way his body's instincts told him was appropriate for an Omega moving through alpha-dominant spaces. He came around a corner and walked straight into a wall of dark fabric and the faint cool scent of something like pine and deep water, and he stumbled back 2 steps and looked up. Ryan Nacht was taller than the novel had made him seem. He stood with the particular stillness of someone who had never needed to fill a room with noise because the room already rearranged itself around his presence. His hair was pale, almost silver in the morning corridor light, and his eyes were a shade of gray that was not soft at all. He looked at Seo Kael with an expression that was almost nothing, the practiced blankness of someone who had decided long ago that expressions were unnecessary expenses. The original Kael had seen Ryan from a distance several times and had always been careful to stay exactly there, at a distance, because Victor had told him that Ryan did not like being approached by Omegas he had not invited into his space. Seo Kael knew, from having read the entire novel, that this was actually not true. But the original Kael had believed it, and his body believed it now, because Seo Kael felt his breath catch and his instincts urge him to look back down and apologize quietly and step to the side. He looked down. He started to speak. And then something in him, the part that was still a university student who had stayed up too late reading about a boy who died because he stayed too quiet, pushed back against the instinct. He looked up again. It was a single second. Just 1 second of eye contact with Ryan Nacht, gray eyes meeting eyes that were probably dark brown in this body but felt like his own. Just 1 second of looking at the most powerful person in the building like he was a person rather than a warning sign. Then Seo Kael lowered his gaze, stepped carefully to the side, and said in a quiet and perfectly steady voice that he was sorry for getting in the way. Ryan said nothing. He walked forward. And then, when he was already 2 steps past, he paused. Seo Kael heard the pause before he registered it, the half-breath of someone stopping when they had intended to continue. He did not look back. He kept walking toward the library. But his hands, hidden in the sleeves of the plain gray clothing he had found in the wooden chest, were trembling slightly, and not entirely from fear. In the original novel, Ryan Nacht had never once paused for Kael. The library was vast and organized in a way that suggested someone had cared about it a long time ago and that care had since gone unreplaced. Books were shelved but not in any system that made immediate sense. Records were stacked in ways that prioritized fitting them somewhere over finding them again. The librarian, an older beta named Mawson who wore ink on his fingers and a look of permanent mild exhaustion, glanced up when Seo Kael entered and nodded faintly before returning to the document he was working on. Seo Kael spent 3 hours in the library that morning. He found the records he had come looking for within the first 40 minutes, old Omegaverse law documents that covered the rights and separation procedures of Omega companions, because he needed to understand precisely what his options were within this world's rules rather than just within the story's plot. He spent the remaining time learning the library's organization and, without making any comment about it to Mawson, quietly beginning to sort the nearest section into an arrangement that actually made sense. When Mawson noticed what he was doing, he said nothing for a long moment. Then he set down his pen and asked if Kael had a particular system in mind. Seo Kael explained it simply and clearly. Mawson looked at the newly organized shelf, then at Kael, and then he nodded once and went back to his document. It was not friendship. But it was the beginning of being seen as useful, which in this world, Seo Kael was beginning to understand, was the first and most important step toward any form of safety. He returned to his room before evening. He ate the dinner the same wordless servant brought. He waited. The knock came at 9. A young servant with careful eyes and a practiced smile carried a small green glass bottle on a silver tray and delivered Victor Lane's warmest wishes and his hope that the tonic would maintain Kael's good health through the coming season. Seo Kael thanked him with a voice that did not shake. He closed the door. He carried the bottle to the window where a thin terracotta pot held a small trailing plant that the original Kael had kept because it was the only living thing in the room that was entirely his. He poured every drop of the tonic into the soil. Within 4 minutes the leaves began to curl at their edges. Within 8 minutes they had turned a color between yellow and brown that had nothing to do with normal wilting. Seo Kael watched this happen with his arms wrapped around himself and his back straight and his face very still. He had known this was coming. He had read it. He had predicted it with the clinical accuracy of someone working from a script. But knowing a thing in your mind and watching the small plant that someone had loved begin to die from the liquid that was supposed to be inside your body were entirely different experiences, and the difference landed in the center of his chest and stayed there like a stone. The original Kael's memories moved through him quietly, all of them involving Victor, all of them warm, all of them now carrying this new weight at their edges. Years of trust. Years of choosing to believe in someone who had been calculating the most efficient way to remove him from the story. Seo Kael stood at the window for a long time after the plant went still. Then he straightened, set the empty green bottle back on the tray, and sat down on the narrow bed. He was still here. He was still breathing. The chapter that was supposed to end him had passed while he was standing at a window and thinking, which was perhaps the most fitting possible way for someone like him to survive it. He thought about the library, and the law records, and Masson's nod, and the 1 second of eye contact in the east corridor that had made the most untouchable person in the academy pause mid-step. 3 pages. That was all the original story had given this body, this name, this life. Seo Kael pulled the wool blanket over his shoulders, looked at the dark ceiling, and began planning Chapter 4. Victor Lane arrived at Kael's door the following morning wearing his most comfortable smile, the one that sat on his face the way expensive furniture sat in a room, placed deliberately and meant to be admired. He stepped inside without knocking, which was something he had always done and which the original Kael had always quietly accepted because Victor had a way of making his habits feel like they were simply the natural order of things. He looked around a small room with the particular gaze of someone checking rather than visiting, eyes moving across the wooden chest, the narrow bed, the table, and finally settling on Kael himself, who was sitting on the edge of the bed with his hands folded in his lap and his expression arranged into something soft and unhurried. Victor's eyes moved to the windowsill where the small plant sat in its terracotta pot. The leaves were curled and brown at the edges. He looked at this for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked back at Kael and his smile did not change in any visible way, but something behind it rearranged itself so slightly that only someone who had been studying his face with the specific purpose of surviving him would have caught it. Seo Kael caught it. He had spent the hours before sleep the night before going through every memory the original Kael carried of Victor, not the feelings attached to them, which were complicated and belonged to someone else, but the patterns within them. The way Victor's eyes moved when he was calculating. The way his voice warmed by half a degree when he wanted something. The way he asked questions that already contained the answer he preferred. Seo Kael had organized these observations the same way he had organized the library shelf, methodically, into a system he could actually use. Victor asked how he was feeling. Seo Kael said he was feeling well rested, that he had slept better than he had in weeks. Victor said he was glad to hear it, that he had been a little worried about Kael's health lately and hoped the tonic he had sent had been helpful. Seo Kael looked at him with warm and uncomplicated eyes and said the tonic had been very kind of him and that he had been grateful for the thought. Victor held his gaze for 1 beat longer than the conversation required. Seo Kael did not look away first. There was nothing Victor could say to that. He had no proof of anything. Kael was alive, apparently fine, and thanking him pleasantly, which left Victor holding a concern he could not name out loud without revealing the reason he had it. He said a few more light and friendly things, smiled his careful smile, and left. Seo Kael waited until the sound of his footsteps faded down the stone corridor. Then he let out the breath he had been holding at the very back of his throat for the entire conversation and sat with his hands pressed flat on his knees for a long moment, feeling the cold and steady fact of what he had just done settle into his body properly. He had looked the person who tried to kill him in the eye and given him absolutely nothing to work with. That was a beginning. It was a very fragile beginning made of nothing but composure and the advantage of knowing the shape of someone's intentions, but it was real and it was his and he intended to build on it carefully. The first thing he needed was something to stand on that Victor had not built and therefore could not remove. He returned to the library that morning. Mawson was already at his desk when Kael arrived, and he looked up with the same expression of mild exhaustion he had worn the day before, except that when his eyes landed on Kael there was a small additional quality to it, something closer to recognition, which was different from simply registering that someone had walked in. Kael nodded to him, moved to the section he had begun organizing the previous day, and continued without being asked. He worked through the morning with quiet focus, sorting records by date and subject in a way that built on the system he had explained to Mawson, expanding it section by section into the parts of the shelves that had been untouched the longest and were therefore the most chaotic. There was something clarifying about the work. It required attention but left enough of his mind free to think, and he needed to think about what resources this world actually offered him as an Omega with no rank, no family, and no affiliation beyond the one he was in the process of carefully stepping away from. By midday he had reorganized 2 full sections and found, tucked into the back of a shelf behind a collapsed row of old administrative files, a complete set of Omegaverse legal texts that Mawson had apparently been looking for long enough that he had given up. When Kael brought them to the desk, Mawson set down his pen and looked at the stack of books for a moment. Then he asked Kael his name. Kael told him. Mawson wrote it in a small notebook at the corner of his desk in the deliberate way of someone who wrote down things they intended to remember, and then he said that Kael was welcome to use the library's reference section whenever he liked, which was a privilege not typically extended to Omega companions and which Kael accepted with a steady thank you and the precise understanding of how much that single sentence was worth. He ate his midday meal in the East Garden, which was a long narrow courtyard along the Academy's outer eastern wall where someone had planted roses along the stone in the past and then apparently stopped tending them so that they had grown into a wild and slightly overgrown arrangement that was beautiful in the way things were beautiful when nobody was making them perform. There was a bench at the far end under the thickest part of the rose growth, a little hidden from the main garden path, and the original Kael had come here occasionally in the memories Seo Kael now carried, though always briefly and always with the awareness that he should not spend too much time away from wherever Victor expected him to be. Seo Kael sat on the bench and ate his lunch without hurrying and let the garden be quiet around him. He did not notice Ryan nacked until Ryan had already been sitting at the other end of the bench for several minutes. He had approached from the direction of the inner academy wall through a narrow gap in the rose growth that was not visible from the main path, which explained why Seo Kael had not seen him arrive. Ryan was sitting with one long leg crossed over the other and an open book resting on his knee, and he was reading with the focused and slightly closed quality of someone who had come here specifically because nobody else knew about this particular bench and he preferred it that way. He was not looking at Kael. He was giving every outward impression of being entirely unaware that Kael was there, except that the angle of his body had shifted by a few degrees from where it might naturally have been if the bench had been empty, a tiny unconscious adjustment that created the faintest possible acknowledgement of shared space. Kael looked at him for a moment. Then he finished his lunch and looked at the roses and let the silence be what it was. Ryan did not speak. Kael did not speak. A small bird landed in the rose growth above the bench, reconsidered, and left again. Somewhere in the main courtyard on the other side of the academy wall, someone was training and the distant rhythmic sounds of it came and went on the breeze. The garden held them both in its overgrown quiet for the better part of an hour, and then Ryan closed his book, stood, and turned to leave through the gap in the roses. He paused with his back still half turned and said, without looking directly at Kael, that the roses on the east wall grew better when the dead growth was cleared from the base. He said it in the tone of someone noting a general fact about horticulture and not at all in the tone of someone speaking to a specific person. Then he walked away through the rose gap and was gone. Kael looked at the base of the rose growth along the east wall. There was a significant amount of dead and tangled old stem crowding the new growth, which he had noticed earlier without consciously registering it. He filed the comment away in the same mental space where he was keeping all the other things about Ryan Knack that did not quite match the first impression of absolute blankness, and then he finished the last of his water and returned to the library for the afternoon. The days that followed built on each other the way careful things built, not dramatically, but with the kind of consistency that became its own form of strength. Kael returned to the library every morning. He expanded the organizational system through another 3 sections by the end of the first week and found 2 more sets of missing records in the process, which Mawson received each time with the same quiet addition to his small notebook. Kael began to understand the library's history through the things he found in it, the gaps where records should have been, the subjects that had been organized carefully and the ones that had been neglected, the difference between what the Academy publicly valued and what it actually spent its administrative attention on. He also began clearing the dead growth from the base of the east wall roses. He did this in the early morning before the main Academy population was moving through the grounds, working quietly with a small pair of garden shears he borrowed from the groundskeeper after helping the man untangle a blocked drainage channel near the Academy's north entrance. The groundskeeper, a wide and weathered beta named Soren who had worked the Academy grounds for longer than most of its current students had been alive, accepted Kael's help without comment and lent him the shears without being asked twice. Soren was another addition to the small and sturdy list of people who were beginning to recognize Kael's face as something other than background. Ryan was in the East Garden again 3 days later. And 2 days after that. And then the following week on 2 separate evenings. He never announced himself and he never made any remark about the fact that the garden bench was now consistently occupied by the same Omega he had bumped into in the East Corridor. He brought his book. He read. The silence between them was not uncomfortable in the way silences could be uncomfortable when 2 people were pretending the other did not exist. It was more like the silence of 2 people who had separately decided that this particular patch of garden was the best place to be, and had arrived at the same conclusion independently, and were being honest about that without needing to make a conversation out of it. It was on the 5th shared evening in the garden that Ryan spoke first. He had closed his book and was looking at the rose growth along the east wall, which had opened 3 new buds in the past few days now that the base had been properly cleared and the new stems had room to move toward the light. He said, without preamble, that the roses looked better. Kael said that they had needed the space. Ryan was quiet for a moment and then he said that most things did. He said it without any apparent awareness that it was a meaningful thing to say, in the same way he had noted the dead growth a week ago, as a simple observation about the state of things. Kael looked at him in profile, the pale hair catching the late light, the careful stillness of a person who had made an art form of not revealing what was happening behind his eyes, and felt something settle in his understanding of who this person actually was beneath the novel's description of him. Ryan Knack was not cold. He was precise. There was an important difference. Cold people felt nothing and showed nothing. Ryan felt things with what seemed like considerable depth and had simply decided a long time ago that the feeling and the showing were 2 separate activities and that the second one was optional. The novel had called him cold because it was describing him from the outside, from the perspective of characters who never got close enough to hear the things he said when he was not guarding every word. Seo Kael, who had spent his university years reading people in study groups and crowded lecture halls and the specific social geography of shared dormitory spaces, was close enough to hear them now. He began tending the east wall roses every morning. Victor noticed the change in Kael's patterns before he identified what was actually changing. He had expected, after the failed tonic, to find Kael either weakened or afraid, either quietly sick or visibly anxious in the way that would have made him easier to manage while Victor planned something more permanent. Instead Kael was the same temperature he had always been on the surface, warm and gentle and carefully unremarkable, except that he was now unremarkable in places Victor had not given him permission to be. The library. The groundskeeper's yard. The East Garden that Victor had never cared about because it had no social value. Victor began watching more carefully. This was something Seo Kael had predicted and prepared for. He was meticulous about what he showed. Around Victor he remained exactly as the original Kael had always been, deferential and quiet and apparently without ambition. He said nothing about the library or Masson's notebook. He said nothing about Sorn and the garden shears. He gave Victor nothing to grab onto. And when Victor, with the precision of someone who had spent years managing others' perceptions, suggested one afternoon that Kael seemed to be spending a great deal of time in areas of the academy that were not really appropriate for a companion of his position, Kael looked at him with genuine seeming puzzlement and said he had only been trying to make himself useful since he understood he had no formal role here and did not want to be a burden to anyone. Victor could not argue with that without revealing that usefulness was actually the thing that concerned him, so he smiled and said that was very thoughtful of Kael and the subject was closed. The conversation that changed the entire shape of things between Ryan and Kael happened on a Tuesday evening 10 days into Seo Kael's life inside the novel. He had stayed in the library later than usual because Mawson had asked him to help locate a specific administrative record that was needed for an upcoming review of academy enrollment procedures. They had found it eventually, tucked inside a box of documents from 4 years prior that had been shelved under the wrong subject, and Mawson had gone home looking slightly less exhausted than usual, which Kael was beginning to understand was his version of looking genuinely pleased. Kael was the last person in the library and had been about to leave when he stopped at the legal records section and pulled out one of the Omegaverse law texts he had been working through steadily in whatever time he had between tasks. He was deep in a chapter on the formal procedures for an Omega requesting independent status, which was a legal pathway that technically existed in this world but was so rarely used that most people, including most Omegas, did not know it was there, when the library door opened and Ryan walked in. Ryan saw him immediately, because the library was otherwise empty and Kael was sitting directly under the best lamp in the room. He did not leave. He walked to the far shelves, found the book he had apparently come for, and then, instead of walking back out, came and sat down at the table across from Kael. He looked at the open law text. He looked at Kael. He asked, in a voice that was not demanding but was very direct, why a companion Omega would be reading independent status law at 8:30 in the evening. Kael considered the question. Then he said that he was trying to understand what his options actually were because he had spent a long time not knowing he had any. Ryan was quiet for long enough that the lamp between them flickered once in a draft from somewhere in the old building's walls. Then he said that most Omegas in the academy were never told those options existed. Kael said that he was aware of that now. Ryan asked him who had told him. Kael said he had found it himself. Ryan looked at him steadily for a moment with those gray eyes that were precise rather than cold, and said that was unusual. Kael said that he was beginning to think unusual was not the problem he had always been taught it was. Ryan did not smile. But something in his face opened by a fraction, the way a door opened when the latch was turned by someone with the right key, not wide, just enough to feel the air from the other side. He set his own book on the table and asked if Kael had found anything useful in the legal text yet. They talked for an hour and 40 minutes. About the law at first, and then about the academy's structures, and then about nothing in particular but in the way that nothing in particular between two people who are genuinely interested in each other's thinking was actually everything. Ryan did not volunteer personal information. But he asked questions with the quality of someone who actually wanted the answers, and he listened to the answers with the same precision he seemed to bring to everything, and twice during the conversation he said something that surprised Kael so thoroughly with its depth and its honesty that Kael had to take a moment before responding. When Kael finally stood to leave and gathered the law text to return to its shelf, Ryan stood as well and said, with his eyes on the middle distance rather than directly on Kael, that the East Garden bench would likely be empty tomorrow evening if Kael had no other place to be. It was not an invitation exactly. It was more like information being shared between two people who had both noticed the same useful fact and were acknowledging it without making more of it than it currently was. Seo Kael returned the book to its shelf and said that he would probably find his way there, and walked out of the library and into the cool stone corridor and did not let himself feel the warmth gathering in his chest until he was far enough away that the feeling was entirely his own and nobody else could see what it looked like on his face. Victor was waiting outside Kael's room. He was leaning against the wall with his arms loosely folded, and he was wearing the smile that appeared when something had happened that he had not anticipated and was in the process of deciding how to address. He asked where Kael was coming from. Kael said the library. Victor's eyes moved over him with the practiced efficiency of someone taking inventory. He said it was late for library visits. Kael said Mawson had needed help with a record search. Victor said nothing further, just held the smile and the assessment for one more beat, and then said good night and pushed off the wall and walked away down the corridor. Kael went inside his room, closed the door, and stood with his back against it in the dark for a moment. Victor was recalculating. He could feel it the way you felt weather changing before the sky showed it. The next thing Victor tried would be bigger than a poison tonic delivered quietly to a room where no one would ask questions until morning. Seo Kael did not yet know what shape it would take. But he knew it was coming, the same way he knew, with a certainty that was warm and steady and new, that the East Garden bench would be occupied by two people tomorrow evening, and that the story he was living in was becoming something the original novel had never thought to write. Nobody in the Alpha Academy talked about the way power worked in quiet rooms. They only talked about the way it worked in loud ones, in training halls and ranking ceremonies and public competitions where strength was measured in visible and dramatic ways. But Seo Kael had spent enough time in this world now to understand that the truly important things never happened in loud rooms. They happened in corridors after dark, in library shelves where records were filed incorrectly on purpose, in small green bottles delivered by smiling servants, and in the particular quality of silence that surrounded Victor Lane in the days following the library corridor encounter. Victor did not come to Kael's room the next morning. This was notable because Victor had maintained a pattern of morning visits since Kael's arrival at the academy, not out of warmth. Seo Kael now understood with a clarity that belonged entirely to him and not to the original Kael's forgiving memory, but out of management. The visits were inventory checks disguised as care, brief appearances designed to confirm that Kael was where he was supposed to be, feeling what he was supposed to feel, and moving through the world in the small and dependent way that kept him useful to Victor without ever becoming inconvenient. The morning Victor stopped coming was the morning he shifted from managing Kael to planning something that required more preparation than a simple visit. Seo Kael used the extra time to go to the library early. He had been building towards something for the past week and a half, not obviously, not in any way that would read as threatening to someone watching him from the outside, but with the consistent and unhurried focus of someone laying a foundation brick by brick under the surface of ordinary days. The legal text on independent Omega status had led him to a second text on Academy administrative law, which had led him to a third document, older and less organized, that outlined the formal rights and responsibilities of Alpha sponsors within the Academy system. And buried within those rights and responsibilities, written in the careful and slightly convoluted language of institutional rules that nobody read because everyone assumed they already knew the rules, was something that Seo Kael had read 3 times to be certain he had understood it correctly. An Alpha sponsor at the Academy was legally required to maintain accurate records of their companion Omega's status, health, and conduct. These records were submitted to the Academy administration quarterly and were part of the formal accountability structure that justified allowing non-student Omegas on the grounds. The records Victor had submitted for Kael over the past year were filed in the Academy's administrative archive, which Mawson, as head librarian, had access to and which Kael had therefore quietly been granted access to through the small but real authority of being the person who had reorganized 4 sections of records and found 3 sets of missing documents in 11 days. The records Victor had submitted were immaculate. That was the first thing Seo Kael noticed about them. They were detailed and warm and painted a picture of a responsible and attentive Alpha sponsor caring for a quiet and grateful Omega companion. They were also, in 3 specific instances across the past 8 months, inconsistent with dates and events that Kael could cross-reference through other administrative records that Victor had not thought to check because they existed in a section of the archive that had been effectively invisible under 11 years of disorganization. The training evaluation schedules. The medical supply requisitions. The gate entry and exit logs that recorded every person who moved through the academy's main entrance on any given day. Victor had falsified his companion records. Not dramatically, not in ways that would be obvious to someone doing a routine check, but in ways that, when placed beside the other documents, created a picture that did not match itself. On a date when Victor's records claimed he had accompanied Kael to a health evaluation at the Academy's medical wing, the gate logs showed Victor had left the Academy grounds at midday and not returned until evening. On a date when the records showed a formal welfare check completed by Victor's own hand, the medical supply requisitions showed no materials dispensed to Kael's room number for that entire month. These were not the records of a genuinely attentive sponsor. They were the records of someone who had learned what attentiveness was supposed to look like on paper and reproduced the appearance of it without the substance. Seo Kael copied the relevant dates and cross-references carefully into the small writing kit the original Kael had kept in the wooden chest. He was methodical about it, noting the document name, the archive location, and the specific inconsistency for each entry. He was not angry while he did this work. He was focused, which was a different and more useful state entirely, and when he was finished he sat for a moment in the library's morning quiet and looked at what he had gathered and understood that it was not yet enough to act on but that it was the foundation of enough. Mawson arrived at his desk at the usual hour, set down his ink-stained bag, and looked at Kael over the rim of his reading spectacles with the expression that had become, over nearly 2 weeks, something that functioned as a morning greeting between them. He asked if Kael had found anything interesting. Kael said he had found some date inconsistencies in the sponsor records that might be worth a closer administrative look. Mawson was quiet for a moment, filling his pen with careful and unhurried movements, and then he said that sponsor records were reviewed by the Academy's administrative board during the monthly compliance check, which happened to be scheduled for the following week. He said this to the surface of his desk rather than to Kael directly, in the tone of someone sharing general institutional information that happened to be accurate and relevant, and then he opened the document he was working on and said nothing further about it. Kael understood. He thanked Mawson for mentioning it. Mawson said he had not mentioned anything in particular and returned to his work. The East Garden that evening held both of them the way it had begun to reliably hold both of them, with the specific comfort of something becoming a pattern that both people wanted to maintain without either of them yet naming what the pattern was. Ryan arrived through the rose gap at the usual time. He sat at the usual distance. He had his book but he opened it less frequently than he used to, which Kael had noticed over the past several evenings and which he understood was not restlessness but attention redirected. Ryan asked that evening, without looking away from the middle distance where the rose growth met the Academy's outer wall and a tangle of old wood and new green, whether Kael had made any progress with the legal text on independent status. Kael said he had and that he had also found some additional documents that added context to what he was working through. Ryan turned his head and looked at him directly, which he did less often than people who were paying less attention, and asked if he meant the administrative archive. Kael held his gaze and said yes. Ryan was quiet for a moment and then he said that the archive had been largely inaccessible for over a decade due to its disorganization and that it was interesting that it appeared to be accessible now. Kael said that things became accessible when someone took the time to put them in order. Ryan looked at him with those precise gray eyes for long enough that the evening light shifted perceptibly around them. Then he looked back at the roses and said that some people in this academy relied on things remaining disorganized. His voice carried no particular inflection when he said it. It was simply a statement about the way the world worked, delivered in the tone of someone who had observed this for a long time and had formed a clear and privately held opinion about it. Kael filed it beside everything else he was quietly learning about who Ryan Nacht actually was when nobody was watching him perform the role of the Academy's most untouchable alpha. He asked Ryan that evening, carefully and without the weight of expectation behind the question, whether he had ever experienced someone he trusted behaving in ways that only made sense when you looked at them from outside the trust. He did not explain why he was asking. He simply asked it and let it sit between them in the garden air. Ryan was very still for a long moment. Then he said that when he was 19, someone he had considered his closest companion had reported false conduct violations against him to the Academy's senior board, violations serious enough that his ranking had been frozen for 4 months while the investigation was completed. He said this in a flat and even voice, the voice of someone who had processed the fact of a thing completely and set the feeling of it somewhere very deep. The companion had done it, Ryan said, because Ryan's rising rank had threatened the position the companion had spent 2 years building for himself, and removing Ryan from the rankings for 4 months had been enough to secure the placement he had been competing for. By the time the investigation cleared Ryan entirely, the placement was confirmed and could not be reversed. He had never told anyone that. Kael understood this without being told, the way you understood the weight of something by the care with which someone set it down. He did not say he was sorry because Ryan did not want the event mourned. He said that it made sense now why Ryan read alone and walked through empty corridors and had apparently claimed a hidden garden bench as the one place in the Academy where he could be certain of not being managed by someone with an agenda. Ryan looked at him sharply, the way people looked when something had described them more accurately than they expected. Then something in the sharp look softened at its edges, not into vulnerability exactly, but into something that was no longer performing its own absence. Ryan said that Kael was the first person in 2 years to sit on that bench without wanting something from him. Kael thought about this honestly before he responded. Then he said that was not entirely true, that he had wanted something from the beginning, but what he had wanted was the garden and the quiet, and Ryan had simply been there already, and wanting those things had not required anything from Ryan at all. Ryan looked at him for a long time. The garden held them in its particular and overgrown stillness. Then Ryan reached out and, with the careful deliberateness of someone doing something they had considered and chosen rather than something that simply happened to them, covered Kael's hand where it rested on the bench between them with his own. It was a light and steady thing, not demanding, not temporary either. Kael looked down at it. Then he looked up at Ryan and did not move his hand away, and the roses grew quietly around them in the last of the evening light. What happened the following morning happened quickly and in public, which was the way Victor had designed it. Kael was crossing the main Academy courtyard on his way to the library when 2 senior Academy officials appeared at the far end of the courtyard and walked directly toward him with the brisk and purposeful movement of people executing an instruction they had been given with enough authority that they had not thought to question it. Behind them, at a distance that suggested coincidence but was not, walked Victor Lane with his hands folded behind his back and his expression composed into something that looked remarkably like reluctant concern. The officials told Kael that a number of restricted Academy documents had been reported missing from the administrative archive and that his room had been identified as a location to be searched in connection with the report. They were polite about it, official and neutral in the way of people doing a job, but the courtyard had filled in the way courtyards filled when something official and visible was happening, students and staff appearing at edges and doorways and upper windows with the particular attention that gathered around anything that looked like consequence. Kael stood in the center of the courtyard and looked at the officials and then at Victor and did not allow his face to do anything other than remain calm. He said he understood and that he had no objection to the search. He said this clearly enough to be heard by the courtyard's edges. Then he asked, in the same clear and unhurried voice, whether he might also request that the administrative board review the sponsor records filed on his behalf over the past year in connection with the same archive review, as he had recently identified several date inconsistencies that he believed the board should be aware of. The courtyard was very quiet. Victor's expression did not break. He was too skilled for that. But it shifted beneath itself the way ice shifted when the temperature changed, a movement that was not yet visible at the surface but that changed the structural fact of the thing completely. He said smoothly that he was sure that would be unnecessary and that the officials could proceed with the search. Kael said again, pleasantly and without any edge, that he would appreciate the board's review all the same. The search of Kael's room took 40 minutes. The officials found exactly what Victor had placed there 3 days earlier, a bundle of restricted documents tucked behind the wooden chest in a location that was slightly too deliberate to be either a hiding place chosen by someone experienced or a coincidence. They brought the documents to the headmaster's hall where Victor was already waiting, his concern now fully visible and directed at Kael with the performance of a person who was sad to be right. The headmaster was a tall and serious beta woman named Caldress who had run the academy for 11 years and who had the particular quality of someone who had seen enough human behavior to be difficult to perform for effectively. She looked at the documents. She looked at Kael. She asked if he had anything to say. Kael reached into the front of his plain jacket and removed the folded pages he had been carrying close to himself for 5 days, the careful notes he had made in the library, each inconsistency documented with its source, its archive location, and its cross-reference. He placed them on the headmaster's desk with both hands and said that he did have something to say and that he hoped the board would allow him the time to say it properly. He spoke for 12 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He moved through each inconsistency in the sponsor records methodically, naming the document, the date, the discrepancy, and the cross-reference that revealed it. He was not dramatic about it. He was accurate, and accuracy in a room with a headmaster who valued institutional integrity over social comfort was a more powerful thing than any amount of drama. Victor attempted to speak twice. The headmaster asked him to wait both times. When Kael finished, the room was quiet. Headmaster Caldress looked at the notes and then at Victor and then at the officials and said that a full administrative review would be initiated immediately and that all parties were to remain available to the board. She said it in the measured tone of someone who had already formed a conclusion but was going to follow the proper procedure to confirm it because proper procedure was exactly what distinguished this institution from the behavior currently under review. Victor was not expelled that day. These things took the time they took, and Seo Kael had understood from the beginning that real consequence in institutional settings arrived slowly and through proper channels and not in the dramatic immediate fashion of stories that prioritized satisfaction over accuracy. But Victor's rank was frozen pending review, which meant his authority within the academy was suspended, which meant that his ability to influence Kael's position was effectively removed from the board before the formal investigation had even properly begun. He walked past Kael on his way out of the headmaster's hall and said nothing. His face was composed and unreadable. But his hands, which Kael caught in his peripheral vision as Victor passed, were very slightly rigid at his sides in the way hands were rigid when the rest of the body was working hard to remain controlled. Kael looked straight ahead and let him pass. John was waiting outside the hall. He had been there for the duration, sitting on the stone bench in the corridor with his hands pressed together in his lap and his face showing every feeling he was having in real time because John had never learned to hide his feelings and Kael had quietly decided this was one of the things he valued most about him. When Kael came through the door, John stood up and looked at him with enormous eyes and asked in a voice barely above a whisper whether it had worked. Kael sat down on the bench beside him and said yes. John sat back down and leaned his head briefly against Kael's shoulder and let out a breath so long and so full that it seemed to carry the accumulated tension of the entire past 2 weeks out of him in a single release. They sat there together for a while in the corridor quiet. Ryan found Kael in the East Garden that evening, which was where Ryan always found him now, and Kael understood that this had stopped being coincidence so gradually that neither of them had needed to acknowledge the transition. Ryan sat beside him in the settling dark and said nothing for a long time, which with Ryan was not absence but presence, the particular and unhurried company of someone who understood that silence did not need to be filled to be meaningful. Then Ryan said that what Kael had done in the headmaster's hall that afternoon had required a particular kind of courage. Not the loud kind, he said, the kind that announced itself and wanted to be seen, but the kind that came from someone who had decided what they valued and refused to let that thing be taken away, and that kind was considerably rarer than people recognized because it did not look like courage from the outside. It looked like composure. Kael thought about the original Kael, the boy who had been given 3 pages and a quiet ending, who had loved without condition and been met with calculation, and he thought about how that same capacity for deep and steady feeling had, in different hands and with different knowledge, become the thing that dismantled everything that had tried to erase him. He told Ryan that evening about the independent status application he had completed 2 days prior and submitted to the Academy Board through Masson's administrative access. He would not need Victor's sponsorship within a few weeks if the review proceeded as expected. He would stand in this academy on his own terms, as his own person, with the small and genuinely earned standing he had built through library shelves and drainage channels and rose growth and 12 minutes of accurate speech in a formal hall. It was not dramatic standing. But it was real, which the original version of it had never been. Ryan listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he said, looking at the east wall where the roses had opened 4 more buds since the clearing of the dead growth, that he would like to formally offer Kael his support as an alpha of senior rank within the academy, not as a replacement for the standing Kael was building for himself, but alongside it, because that was how genuine support worked and because Ryan had spent 2 years deciding that no connection was worth the risk of trusting someone and had only recently arrived at the conclusion that this particular calculation had cost him more than it had protected him. He looked at Kael when he said the last part. Kael looked back at him. He said yes. Not to the formal offer, though that was also yes. He said yes to what was underneath the formal offer, to the evening bench and the precise gray eyes and the careful way Ryan handed the truth about himself when he handed it, like something he was still learning he was allowed to give. He said yes the way you said yes to something you had not expected to find inside a story that was supposed to end with you, and to the quiet knowledge that the best chapters were always the ones the original author had not thought to write. The East Garden held them both as the stars came out above the Academy's stone walls, and the roses grew along the old stones in the dark, and somewhere in the administrative archive a set of carefully organized records waited for the board that would convene in the morning, and the story that had been given 3 pages breathed outward into something wide and unhurried and entirely its own. This story belongs to every reader who has ever rooted for the background character, who has ever felt that the best parts of a story were hiding in the margins where nobody thought to look. If this story found something in you that you recognize, share it with someone who needs to hear that the quiet ones are worth watching. Leave a comment telling the world which character you loved most and why. And if you are hungry for the next story, the next world, the next character who refuses to follow the script they were handed, follow along because there are more chapters waiting and every single one of them belongs to you.